Don't know if you heard it, lads, but apparently the internet is over. Everyone is censored. Everyone is silenced. You can't use naughty words on YouTube anymore, let alone make a distasteful joke. Oh, heck no. Heckle no, you can't do that. Even if that nasty joke is for the beneficence of children with cancer. You can't do that anymore. So why the dingle-dangle would I even begin to talk about truth, science, and facts when that truth could potentially hurt someone's feelings, could potentially be perceived of as mean or nasty because it doesn't line up with someone's preconceived notions? I mean, if just giving money to children is not deemed acceptable, as it clearly is not, then I'm just as likely as any other to be silenced for my distillation and dissemination of facts, science, and information, just as much as anyone would be for disseminating hysteria, rumor, gossip, whatever you want to call it, such as the likes of Ethan Ralph or Alex Jones have now been called out, deplatformed, and depersoned. Now aren't I? At least that's the fear, and it should be for all of us who value freedom of expression. We should be worried about what gets out there, about actually having access to information. And that is kind of the cool thing about the internet. You can have access to all of this information. Which is why, before I go on my tirade as I'm about to do, all of the links will be in the description. If you wish to read any of this research, most of it is actually not behind paywalls. This stuff, I'm going to provide to you with the best of my ability, so that you can read it for yourself and make up your own mind. And why is that so important? Because today's topic deals with healthcare, and particularly personal mental health and well-being. So, let's get into it a little bit, shouldn't we? We have to then begin with the words of the gentleman, the scholar, the sultan of supplements, Uncle AJ Alex Jones.
I don't like them putting chemicals in the water that turn the friggin' frogs gay. Do you understand that? Turn the friggin' frogs gay. Serious crap.
What did he mean by this? If you've never heard that quote before, it does sound crazy, right? Except Alex Jones wasn't actually entirely wrong on principle. He was just fuzzy on the details. It turned out that, yes, he was right. Certain chemicals had been placed into the water that were affecting the sexual development of certain frog species. Everyone and their mother mocked Alex Jones over this clip, and continued to use it as evidence of his unhinged proclivities, and continued to do so to this day, as he has been unpersoned. But the fact remains, his claims were not without source or without reference. He actually was citing something kind of legitimate, even if it was in a very, I suppose you could say haphazard way.
If you haven't got 'em, buy 'em now. I was right about
frogs.
Get 'em and see why. Write me here in my award-winning communication trailer, Space Nguyen, Blue Mouse Trailer Resort, Hellmouth, California, 90666.
That means, though, that it is easy in the wake of such seemingly silly statements, which at their face are conspiratorial, such as Jones's now infamous "Obama put chemicals in the water to turn the frogs gay" statement, that all statements of a similar nature are easy to dismiss as absurdist on their face. But is that really true? Should we trust the federal government to introduce chemical compounds into the water which may have various effects on both humans and animals in the mere hope that Papa federal government knows best? Because were we to question, well, then you're just a conspiracy theorist, right? And hang on before you turn me off here, famlam. I'm not about to talk about how you shouldn't vaccinate your kids, or about how Hillary Clinton, sacrifices infants to Moloch, which she does. We all know that to be true. I'm here instead, though, to talk about the capacity for the federal government to make sound and reasonable decisions for the entirety of her people when it comes to medical and pharmaceutical implementations and implantations of pharmaceuticals into the general populace. Can the federal government do that reasonably? And do they have a track record of having done it reasonably in the past? Today, though, what we're going to be looking at specifically in this most recent case is the concept of adding lithium into the water supply, not to make the frogs gay, but to make the frogs less suicidal. Looking to the mainstream media, recently there's been a bit of a hubbub on Vox and in a related podcast on the topic of lithium, and introducing a small component or amount of the chemical element into the water supply. Lithium is the atomic element 3, and it is the lightest solid metal on the periodic table. It has many uses, from batteries to nuclear fission, but today we are most interested in it in its combined use with sodium in lithium carbonate, a primary drug in the treatment of bipolar disorder, or what was more commonly at one point referred to as manic depressive disorder. Lithium is used almost exclusively in this case of medical or psychiatric treatment to treat bipolar disorder. It has been found to be relatively ineffective or ineffectual in the treatment of schizophrenic issues and disorders, and although it is sometimes prescribed for serious and severe depressive disorders, generally speaking, lithium is really only used to treat bipolar. Lithium itself is a naturally occurring element, meaning that it is present in differing degrees and differing amounts in drinking water across the world, and is often ingested in very small quantities all the time by all humans. However, beginning in the early 21st century, and perhaps as early as the late 19th century or even late 18th century, depending on who you ask, different physicians began to note the potential mitigating effects of lithium on the symptoms of various psychiatric issues, but particularly in the 21st and 20th century, its effects on bipolar disorder. What is bipolar disorder? It is not as it is often depicted by the mainstream media, or commercial entertainment media at large. That is, it is not so much that 1 second one is happy and joyous and over the moon or extremely excited and erratic, and then the next second is irrevocably sad, depressed, and in the dumps. That's not quite how it works. In actuality, due to these misconceptions, though, that we see so common, bipolar may be one of the least understood psychological disorders, at least in the minds and comprehension of the general public in the current year. Simply put, bipolar does not indicate rapid emotional fluctuations between happy and sad, but rather indicates rather slow transitions between emotional states. It presents in 3 general clinical categories, that being bipolar 1, bipolar 2, and cyclothymia, which is often subclinical. All of these conditions are typified by the presentation of periods, though, of mania and depression, highs and lows. Mania can include many symptoms, but they may be things such as social disinhibition, extreme risk-taking, insomnia or excess energy, and even auditory or visual hallucinations. While depression is, as you may be more familiar, typified by sadness, hopelessness, and desires for self-harm or even suicide. Bipolar 1 describes individuals who experience similar frequencies of both mania and depression, while bipolar 2 describes individuals who experience mostly or predominantly depressive states with shorter or more acute manic states in tandem. Further, cyclothymia describes individuals who may experience only mild periods of depression with only paramanic or hypomanic interruptions. Why does this matter, and why should we treat this disease? Well, because it has great potential to harm the self long-term in any variety of ways. People who have bipolar are at a much greater risk of self-harm and suicide. In a fantastic look into the mind of a person struggling with bipolar disorder, Dr. K. Redfield Jamison's book, An Unquiet Mind, follows her autobiographical journey through undergraduate, graduate, and then doctoral school work while she attempts to cope with the euphoria and the high productive nature of mania, in contrast to the sluggish and or at best low productive nature of depression, in explaining why people who suffer from bipolar in its various forms may prefer in fact to disregard their medication in order to continue to experience that high that is elicited by their manic episodes. However, also making very clear that when the high recedes, the low remains, and depression becomes suicidal ideation. But if you've ever wondered what it's like to be a bipolar doctoral student and live my life, and clearly Dr. Redfield Jamison's life, I highly recommend checking out the book. Of course, link is always in the description. While antidepressants can often help treat the overwhelming sensation of hopelessness that accompanies depression, bipolar requires unique treatment for the upswings into mania, and for this, seemingly by serendipity, psychologists and psychiatrists discovered on accident the benefit of lithium carbonate. Lithium has been used officially by the FDA as a mood stabilizer for the treatment of bipolar disorder since 1970, but has been taken as a cure for various ailments since at least the late 19th century. As of an ongoing NIMH study on the effectiveness of lithium in the treatment of bipolar disorder, individuals taking lithium reported decreased severity of bipolar symptoms in aggregate, and in specificity, decreased reports of intensity of depression, but with potentially actually increased rates of mania. Although it is important to note that only perhaps the most severe cases are prescribed lithium as a treatment in the first place. Moreover, and of more interest to us today though, there is a reported decrease in bipolar patients' suicide attempts in comparison to their lithium ingestion. Thus, we see that lithium does have an impact on preventing suicide, at least in those who suffer from bipolar disorder, to whom are going to be the only people prescribed lithium, generally speaking. So the question is, should we maybe all take a little bit of lithium if it helps prevent suicide attempts? Well, if lithium is so great, we should all be taking a little bit of it, right? Well, that's certainly what the mainstream media seems to be advocating. If you thought the aforementioned proposal wasn't so absurd, you wouldn't be the first to ask those kinds of questions, as this 2014 New York Times article by Anna Fels postulates, should we all take a bit of lithium, bringing up that several pieces of excellent research had isolated a correlation between consumption of lithium and reduced suicide rates. Now, several years and several publications later, in 2018, a more recent Vox article and a podcast, as I mentioned, similarly suggested that a touch of lithium may help to reduce suicide rates in aggregate. And after all, that is a major issue and concern to the United States population, right? Tens of thousands of people kill themselves each year, to the tune of about 45,000 US citizens per annum. Of course, I'm sure we should probably ignore the fact that those are mostly men, because that's not a politically correct thing to say, but it is unquestionable suicide is a major public health concern. So, if lithium reduces the rates of suicide, shouldn't we just start pumping it into the water supply all willy-nilly? After all, as I said, lithium is a naturally occurring element. It's natural! It's already in the water of many of our public drinking sources. It's natural. Just put some more in there. You can't get better than natural, right? It's vegan. Well, let's consider what we know about the effects of lithium first. How about that? Or more precisely, let's consider what we don't know. As of now, no one, not me, nor any psychiatrist, psychologist, biologist, or chemist on the planet Earth has any clue why lithium works through a chemical process in its ability to ameliorate the symptoms of bipolar disorder and mitigate suicide. Yeah, it appears to work, but we have no idea why or how it works. So right there, I hope a few red flags have been waved for you, fam, as to why maybe we shouldn't just give everybody a little bit of lithium if we have no idea how or why it works. After over 100 years of using and prescribing this element on any number of people on any regular level of bases, we have absolutely no idea why or how lithium functions on the brain's chemical mechanisms. It is, in that sense, very similar to electroconvulsive therapy, in that it appears on its outset very barbaric. And our early attempts at treating psychiatric diseases was not off base, although it may have seen as such. Electroconvulsive therapy is used today because it actually works. We stumbled upon it seemingly on accident, and as such we cannot still, much as with lithium, describe properly why it works. It's not a very solid foundation, therefore, upon which to encourage major change to government behavior, would you say so? We simply don't know why lithium appears to mitigate these symptoms, including attempts at suicide. Still, lithium does seem consistently capable of aiding the treatment of bipolar disorder, if not other mental disorders, as I've mentioned, proving to be largely ineffectual in the medical compensation of other mental disorders such as schizophrenia. But hang on a second, Aiden. Are you saying that you want people to kill themselves, you evil wench? Well, obviously not. But you know what? Just for the sake of argument, let's assume I did. Let's assume that's what my argument is. Why would I, in contrast, desire a drug, the interactions of which we functionally do not comprehend, be administered to the public in greater quantities than they may be exposed to inherent in groundwater? Why would I want a drug that has some pretty severe side effects if I wanted people to die, not be introduced to the public? Because, I think if that's what I wanted, lithium would be a good drug to go with. But first we need to look at the efficaciousness in lithium in preventing or inhibiting suicide attempts on the total population, right? We need to look at these data. Despite the fact that this drug has been on the market and specifically has been approved by the FDA since 1970, we really, to this date, lack any cumulative research on those undiagnosed with bipolar, on suicide rates, and lithium. Given such a study would require massive amounts of time and resources that are just typically not available, even by major government sponsors, and we would have to have people sign up to take a potentially very dangerous and psychologically affecting medication. That means you gotta pay participants a lot of money. That means you have to go through a lot of institutional review board reviews. You are not going to do that on a shoestring budget. That's some serious data collection. Outside of going through the IRB, you are talking about some highly unethical crap to attempt to do to healthy people with a drug that is known to cause severe side effects without their express and explicit consent. What do I mean by that? Well, friends, because despite all the seemingly good that lithium produces from what I've stated up here out front, it also causes a lot of problems for the human body. Lithium is not and cannot be fully processed by the endocrine system, causing the substance to build up in the human body over a prolonged period of consumption, as Altschul et al. 2016 describe in their overview and review of various clinical manifestations of lithium consumption, including renal dysfunction, neurologic dysfunction, gastrointestinal symptoms, cardiac manifestations, and endocrine abnormalities. Gitlin 2016 in his overview of the research further states, quote, "Lithium has adverse effects on kidneys, thyroid gland, and parathyroid glands, necessitating monitoring of these organ functions. Hence why people who take lithium on the regular need periodic blood analysis." And he notes how lithium compounds in the system over time, leading often to renal complications and even total renal failure over long-term consumption and ingestion of high levels of lithium. Seems that there's a lot that can go wrong when consuming lithium, or at least significant amounts of lithium, right?
Wrong.
That is absolutely
Wrong.
proved over and over again.
Wrong.
At least if you listen to the arguments being given in this article or from the likes of Dr. Nasser Ghaemi of Tufts University, who has conducted some considerable research on the topic himself. Let's look at some of the data then, shall we? First of all, there's a lot to look at here, and as such, I'll only be covering some of the more prominent studies and findings in detail, truncating the less significant ones in terms of how it applies to the current year. Numerous studies have identified a relationship between lithium levels in water supplies and lower crime levels, except those data are possibly confounded by altitude and lithium levels, and with altitude itself having been suggested to be related to various aspects of suicide and mental illness, as in found the many paradoxes of the state of Utah, which is often listed as America's happiest state, yet also as one of her most common users of antidepressant drugs, and is also quite high in suicide rates, sometimes even called part of the suicide belt, but indicating a possible confound on the effects of altitude on happiness, and if altitude on happiness, then altitude on suicide rate, much as seasonal affective disorder may affect the lives of other reportedly high happiness areas, such as many Scandinavian countries, which report being some of the happiest in the world, yet can also have high suicide rates. Keeping that in mind, and despite this, across the globe, numerous studies have correlated groundwater lithium levels with decreased rates of suicide, including Japan, Austria, Greece, Chile, Lithuania, and various parts of the United States, particularly Alabama and Texas. Interestingly though, these results were not replicated everywhere that they were conducted, and we'll get into the cold hard numbers here shortly, but those findings were not present in similar studies conducted in Italy, Portugal, England, Denmark, and other parts of the United States, such as with the supposed mood-elevating benefits of lithium being non-present in a study of Maryland counties. Now, it's very important that I note how all of this research I just mentioned, how every single piece of it, and every single piece I'm about to describe, was conducted non-experimentally. That is, to introduce a group to a substance that might have significant effects on that group's health in any kind of long-term way would be of serious ethical concerns. Now, we can conduct research that does that, but you need a lot of money, and you need to get a lot of government approval for that. Lithium, however, is a naturally occurring substance, as I've said, and that means that people will be intrinsically exposed to greater or lesser amounts of said element without a need for introduced experimentation. This allows for what's called a natural experiment between groups of control, or relative control, those of low lithium exposure, and experimental conditions of high lithium exposure. Now, try to remember the basics of CQC, and by that I mean critical questioning constructs. What problems might arise from these natural experiments? Well, first of all, there can be no causal linkages that we can form here. Correlation is not causation, or else ice cream sales would be the leading cause of robbery, and black-on-black crime could be forgotten as a figment of our imagination. Secondly, a natural experiment prohibits the inclusion of control measures, meaning that any number of variables can affect the outcome, and even when we attempt to input these variables into our regression analysis to identify the percentage of which any individual variable indicates variance accounted for, the more variables we add, the more holistic our view of the subject becomes, but also the less accurately we can isolate a single node within the matrix of any given subject. That sounded really confusing, so let me try to break it down. Imagine, if you will, a pot of stew. The more stuff and items you put into the stew, the more definitions of stew that your dish will meet. If I put in beef or chicken or pork or potatoes or sweet potatoes or turnips and parsnips and carrots, the more things I put in, the more definitions of stew my dish makes. But in contrast, the less capable I am of pulling out any one individual element as distinguishable from any other element. But taking it back to us as humans, instead of a stew in our crock pot, this is a product of thousands of years of human evolution. We don't get to add too much to the mixture individually. Instead, we're left to delineate the ingredients for ourselves, what made up this human pot pie. The more ingredients you put into the equation, the more complete and complex the recipe you like. The more difficult it becomes to separate the individual factors in the process of making the final dish. Third, and finally, is an almost opposite effect of the aforementioned, any number of random elements can impact the results of the natural experiment, and that in and of itself is not completely understood or accounted for, such as altitude, such as any of the other factors that I mentioned. The less we control the study, the less effect we have on experimentation, the less we can claim to isolate the relationships between variables. Is suicide lower because of lithium rates? Because of altitude? Because of population? Because of the number of psychologists that are nearby? Because of the average poverty levels? Because of the average of the marriages, divorce, rapes, homicides, etc.? We can account for these, but the more things you throw into the pot, the more difficult it becomes to separate the chaff from the wheat of data. Are you starting to see how complex this hodgepodge can become very easily? But Aiden, show us the data, show us the data. Well, here it is, lads. As stated, numerous studies find a relationship between higher lithium levels in the water supply and lower suicide rates, as identified in a review of research by Maurer, Vergne, and Gamey, 2014. Out of 378 articles on lithium assessed, including 35 on lithium in the drinking water, The authors only isolated 9 articles which included unique data on human subjects of the import of lithium in the drinking water, and those specifically looked at suicide rates, of which 4 out of 5 found an association between increased lithium water levels and decreased suicide rates in the populace. The authors noted that 9 out of 11 studies on lithium in the drinking water forwarded beneficial clinical, behavioral, legal, and medical outcomes. However, as with several things in that dataset, I am a bit confused and would like to see the full data analysis and meta-analysis, given that the authors, by their own admission, only accepted 9 studies on drinking water and lithium levels, so not even getting into real numbers hours here, like I'm about to get into. My basic ability to count on my own hands and feet has me a bit suspect. If you say you only found 9 articles about this, but 9 out of 11 confirmed your hypothesis, I'm a little bit confused, skeptical, and concerned by your data. Just saying. Little bit disconcerting. But hey, hang on, they did combine all of their data, so maybe that just explains that discrepancy. So speaking of numbers, let's look at what these scientists actually found for the case of lithium in the water supply. Haybrick et al. 2012, which relies on the same data set as assessed from another study included in the meta, which is Kapusta et al. 2011, provided the most significant evidence, with their regression analysis showing a number of other variables being thrown into the basket, and finding that lithium accounted for 100 times more variance in reducing suicide rates than the prevalence of psychiatrists in the same populated regions of Austria that were analyzed, indicating a negative correlation of R equals negative 0.26, a weak but potentially very impactful relationship between groundwater lithium levels and suicide rates across 99 districts of the Austrian nation. Again, several studies conducted in Japan's southern Kyushu Island Oita Prefecture, which possess a higher natural lithium level in the water, also indicated lower suicide rates in comparison to regions with lower ground lithium water levels. More concerning for us in the United States, Blummel et al. 2013 found across various counties of Texas, which similarly accounting for poverty and even psychiatric help, found that lithium was related to lower suicide rates. It seems then that perhaps it is true. We could all use a little bit of lithium. Wouldn't it be better for us if the government just started putting some lithium in the water supply, just a little bit, to help prevent the 45,000 suicides that occur every year? If we can find even a vague correlation, we might as well just go ahead and have at it, right? Except let's look at the large swaths of data that don't confirm those findings. And more importantly, let's look at those data themselves very carefully to ensure we don't fall into the same pitfalls of conceptual convenience that come with the quick and dirty reporting we often find reproduced and disseminated by media outlets. For example, Oliver et al. 1976, again old, but of import here, in an analysis of populations from various regions of Maryland, 75% of which fell into the low lithium category, were unaffected in comparison to higher groundwater lithium exposure counties. Kalbach et al. 2011 similarly found no association between relatively low levels of lithium versus relatively higher, although still low, levels of lithium, and suicide rates across the United Kingdom. Thus, we can start to see that it appears lithium only has any effect on suicide prevention, if it has any at all, in regions with high levels of lithium within the water supply. Keep that in mind as we go forward. So what about all of these supposedly revolutionary findings about how lithium is so good at preventing suicide? Do they really indicate what they seem to indicate? Should we really put lithium into the water supply to prevent suicide? Well, let's look at the actual data outputs. The Kapusta and Helbig datasets from Austria forwarded in the final weighted multivariate model that while lithium remained a significant predictor of suicide-related mortality, that significance was only marginal in males, with an R squared of 0.4, a beta weight of negative 0.19, and a p-value of 0.06, indicating that the beta weights were weak at best, and the data itself actually failed to reach statistical significance by most standards of alpha of p is less than 0.05. and the female mortality rate even less so, with a R squared of 0.07 with a beta weight of negative 0.22 and a p-value of 0.08. Again, weak beta weights and non-significant alpha levels. You guys don't necessarily have to know what that means. Let me just explain though, those aren't really strong data. And let me also be clear, this is fantastic research. It's well conducted, and it is sound as far as I can tell. But that's not something you base a major political and public health decision on. In the total model, lithium in the water supply accounted for less than 4% of suicide mortality rates. Be aware, that is not a negligible effect. After all, if 4% fewer people died from suicide attempts every year, which again currently hovers near 45,000 per annum in the United States, that would mean nearly 1,800 lives saved. But remember as well, that was Austria. That's not the United States. So what about the United States? Well, the Blumel et al. 2013 data indicated that in counties in the great state of Texas, that those with higher groundwater levels of lithium also forwarded lower suicide rates. However, when we look at the data in total, this becomes again a bit more complex. I described how a regression model analysis is a lot like putting a bunch of ingredients into a pot, and then trying to identify which ingredient accounts for what amount of the flavor, right? A basic regression assumes that all parts are more or less equal or the same between one pot and another pot, that it's going to be relatively consistent. That's called homoscedasticity. However, sometimes I may put a slightly larger potato ratio in there, a touch more paprika, and that throws the entire formulae off of whack, and affects the variance accounted for by any one variable, and that is heteroscedasticity. We can account for these differences though through weighted regression analysis, which is precisely what Blumel and colleagues conducted. And when they accounted for that weighted variation in the data, based on introducing a more complete assessment of the effects of lithium within the model, the results weren't quite so revolutionary. From a glance, yes, it seems that the greater the level of lithium, the lower the suicide rate, but even then, lithium was only significantly associated with suicide rates in population-weighted models, meaning that you understood that more suicide, more population, because, you know, statistical averages. More disturbing for me is that in the log linear Poisson regression model, with only one outlier variable removed, the entire effect disappeared. That is, removing one outlier variable from the weighted model caused the anomaly to seemingly evaporate, indicating the intense fragility of this proposed linear model and association, or inverse association I should be clear, between lithium levels and suicide rates. Further, and of particular interest to us today, in a more recent study published on extensive longitudinal data across the entire nation of Denmark and across 22 years of research, lithium doesn't seem to have a big effect on suicide rates. While many previous studies looked at just a few years of data, this study conducted by Nguyen et al. 2017 is the most comprehensive and long-lasting study of its kind to date, both in terms of its massive number of people and diverse in terms of its scope of an entire country on the subject of lithium groundwater levels and suicide rates, and found effectively nothing. Given the novel status of this research, I would imagine that opponents of it and proponents of a little lithium in all of our lives would argue that the lack of findings are due relatively to the lower levels of lithium across the nation of Denmark, compared to the more extreme levels of lithium in certain counties of Texas, for example. Much as was the critique by Maurer and al. 2014, noting that effects were only absent in regions without more significant quantities of lithium in the groundwater. And that may be true. However, I ask you to consider the significance of the effects given above, as they themselves poses rather complex quandaries about this element of lithium and its effect on mental health and its introduction into groundwater. Look, you guys know this, I know this. I'm about as far from a medical doctor as one can get, well, maybe not quite as far, but I'm certainly far afield. If I can read these data and explain them to you, dear friends, using a soup metaphor, then it's really not quite rocket surgery, now is it? You feel me? These are not basic statistics, but not complicated statistics either. And if I can understand this, you can understand this.
Most of all, remember this. If I can learn to do it, you can learn to do it.
Something in your nose.
There's nothing to it. Follow in my footsteps, shoe by shoe. You can learn to do it too.
So let's define the big issues here then. 1. This research is non-experimental, meaning it is correlational at best. We can compensate for the restrictions of the non-experimental nature of this research through the use of predictive models, that is, regression model analysis. However, we are still looking at, even in the one single study that I have found that seems to find this consistently, only 3.9% of variance accounted for, and even then it's only in one country and only a certain percentage of districts reporting. 2, and on that note, these data are inconsistent with a variety of findings across the world and various nations, and seemingly there is no supportive data in longitudinal analysis of the existence of the positive effects of lithium groundwater levels on suicide reduction rates. And 3, the available information only indicate an impact in instances of particularly high lithium levels in the groundwater, rather than the more mild ones that might be incurred through the proposed minor additives to the water supply that these people, on Vox or in this New York Times article seemingly are suggesting. It's not going to be the kinds of massive amounts of increases to the water supply as would be necessary in order to attain these effects that we cannot even confirm as consistent. Thus, what is the real proposal here? It must be for the government to not add a minor amount of lithium to the water and maybe pray and hope for the best, or rather pray and hope not for the worst, but rather that the government add a significant amount of lithium to the water. And what are the problems there that we can isolate? Well, frankly, beyond everything that I have said at the outset about the medical side effects of lithium, it has a hell of a lot to do with people consciously taking it, and not so much with people unwillingly being participants, being forced to consume those levels of lithium through its inclusion in the public water supply. People who take lithium know they are taking lithium because they have bipolar disorder, because it's the only disorder that it's used to treat, at least effectively. But hang on first. Let's just recall real quickly how often the federal government has really and royally screwed the pooch regarding other supposedly highly researched pharmaceutical drugs that are introduced into the population. The ones that we have a basic idea of how those ones function, unlike lithium, which we don't understand at all. The reactions of humans towards which amounts in scientific phraseology is basically LOL IDK. Let's look at sibutramine. It was on the market for 10 years up until 2010 as a weight loss drug. It was approved by the FDA, despite being related to, guess what, heart attack, stroke, and hypertension, and was being given to the people at greatest risk autonomically to those issues given their obese status. Hey, remember the 80s? Well, you probably don't, fam, because you were likely on government-approved Quaaludes, which were legal under the FDA until 1985 for over 20 years as a sleep aid.
But pretty soon, someone figured out that if you resisted the urge to sleep for just 15 minutes, you got a pretty kick-ass high from it. Didn't take long for people to start abusing ludes, of course, and in 1982, the US government Schedule 1 them, along with the rest of the world, which meant there was only a finite amount of these things left. No shit, you can't even buy them anymore.
And what about the children? What about the children, friends? Oh, the government has a real great history there now, don't they? We only had deaths, a drug sold for 30 years to pregnant women as a method of preventing miscarriage, which was eventually linked to not only various birth defects, but also breast cancer and a host of other related fecundity disorders with no ultimate positive evidence of any anti-abortifacient effects. We also had the infamous thalidomide, a drug which was handed out to pregnant women like candy to treat morning sickness, approved by the US government, and resulted in thousands of children being born with severe, crippling, and often deadly birth defects. All of these drugs tested and approved by the United States government and multiple governments often around the globe. Am I saying don't vaccinate your children? Oh fuck no. I'm saying let's not put chemicals in the water that disallow individual choice until we have some very, very significant and consistent data. And right now we don't have anything approaching that when it comes to the subject of lithium. It seems that yes, there may be some good data behind the introduction of fluoride, but we still don't really have longitudinal data that go on for generations about that now, do we? And right now, as well, we have nothing approaching even that when it comes to the subject of lithium. What instead will you get if you introduce high levels of lithium, of this element, into the water supply, based on the evidence that we do have, under the guiding hand of Papa government, based on the, again, inconsistent but consistent as for what we have, data at our disposal? Well, let me tell you, it's not good, because that information is not sitting along with the rest in a black hole of pure correlational data, as we have looked at with bipolar in pregnant women and have seen how those who continue to take lithium throughout their pregnancy have been affected in different ways from those who ceased. The results are evident in contrast between those who have bipolar and take lithium and those who do not take lithium. And the results are, well, rather harrowing. A study from Newport et al. 2005 found that 100% of their sample of 12 children born to women who continued to take lithium throughout their pregnancy were born with some form of complication, compared to 25% of the 12 children born from women unexposed to lithium. Their findings indicated that lithium permeates the placental barrier, meaning it is in equilibrium across mother and fetus during the duration of the pregnancy. Further, research from Diaz-Citrin 2014 confirmed these results and illustrated the complexities of lithium's involvement in premature pregnancy termination and miscarriage, with women with bipolar who use lithium being significantly more likely to miscarry, experience a stillbirth, or a preterm delivery than women with bipolar not using lithium, and in a greater degree than women in the general populace in contrast. The children of women who used lithium were more likely to have cardiovascular issues as well, but possessed birth defects of any form more frequently than children of women who were not exposed in the 3 countries assessed than those who took lithium. Those 3 countries were Canada, Australia, and Israel. I want to point this all out to you, dear friends, not because I want to scare you, but because I want to illustrate once again how very, very easy it is to manipulate data to prove a point or to create a cause, when really we need a lot more work. Science is not easy. It takes a very long time, and I get very frustrated when I see people trying to cut corners. I really can't speak to the efficaciousness of fluoride in the water. I just can't. I can only provide you with the data I've seen. It does seem there is some evidence that has been efficacious in preventing tooth decay. And that's a good thing, right? Except we don't know, as I've said, every side effect of fluoride. It's a chemical that we understand, though, a hell of a lot more about than lithium, which, one last time, we have no freaking clue how or why it works or how or why it has any effect on our minds. I am more than willing and more than happy for people to take drugs that help them and that make them more well off. However, when we talk about something as complicated as lithium that we do not understand on any level, to suggest placing it into the United States water supply at a greater degree, knowing what we do know about it, that's a really bad idea. Your suicide numbers, which are barely supported, that's not good data. That's not enough to suggest this, to even bring it to the table, it's not enough. I'm sorry. When we allow the government to make decisions for us regarding our health, our livelihood, we thereby give up an aspect of our freedoms, do we not? As I have briefly touched upon here, the government has a really terrible track record of deciding what is good or bad for public health. They go back on it all the time. Things that we took for decades became illegal because it was so screwed up. Even after extensive and modern research, we can be wrong. We're wrong all the time. And when it comes to lithium, which we know, technically speaking, diddly squat about, is this the kind of thing we should be putting in the water? I don't freaking think so. I get why people want the government to control everything. After all, as such a system removes the concept of personal responsibility, poppy government, take care of me. But when we look at the consequences of placing one's fate in the hands of Big Brother, the data are a bit more consistent in that they show that when it comes to something like the effects of lithium on groundwater and suicide, they are not a basis for action. Again, I'm not saying any kind of silly shit like don't vaccinate your kids, no such thing. But most often, what is the case? The government is acting out of mere laziness, or at worst, out of an inadequate education and capacity for understanding the expenditure at which funds should be used in these fields. For the most part, people aren't educated in this stuff, and that's not their fault. It's just like it's not your fault for not knowing this. It's not your responsibility to read something that looks like this data output. You shouldn't have to understand what the hell this means, and understand that if you look at this particular graph versus this particular graph, that's not your goddamn job. It shouldn't be your goddamn job. The problem is that reading this kind of thing takes time, and it often takes money. So I thank you for taking some time to listen to me, to listen to this rant as you go about your day, and do the much more important things that I'm sure you have to do. And remember and think as you go forward, as I'm sure you will, just as critically, that when you come across similar or related conundrums, when there is at least no strong evidence for or against the benefits, that we need to look at things very critically. As of this, there is no strong evidence either for or against the benefits of lithium in groundwater. However, the lack of data for me is proof enough alone is why we should not start pumping it in. Do the research first, let alone the numerous negative psychological and physiological effects that we know are linked to lithium ingestion over time. You can't be expected to read a study for every claim that comes across your desk, my friends. But just remember how easy it is for even very intelligent people to ever so slightly skew the presentation of data, even without their express intention, to make an argument for a case that could be fundamentally flawed, and ultimately thereby change the direction of our entire species. This is why we need to learn how to read research, why we need to learn how to understand this stuff. And that's what I'm here for, lads. If you've enjoyed this video, please be sure to like and subscribe. I'm Aiden Paladin, Altschul.